It's indeed a pleasure to be here and to have conversations around the question of the role of the media in our elections 2007 and what we are doing. Of the allegiance that people had and following, you kind of able to see a little bit of the map of Kenya, and I think majority of us are familiar with that. And then when it came to the elections, I mean, in terms of the competing three parties, that's probably how the distribution was. The blue part doesn't look very blue from here, but tended to have aligned themselves with the PLU, and the green part with the ODM then, and then the red part with the Wiper, now Wiper party. And in final election results broadly reflected that image. So you have basically a divided country. And the question that we are asking ourselves is, what was the role of the media in this? And when you think about the distribution of the media today, about 56% of Kenyans access the print media, and those who study media know that the impact of the print media tends to be long-lasting. In fact, the influence probably takes about 6 months for the impact to really register. 96% of Kenyans access FM radio stations, and this is pretty much across the country. And today we have a plethora of stations that broadcast in various languages and in various sports. 80% of our population have access to mobile telephones. And why this, I think, is important for us, particularly today, is because the telephone, the cell phone is not just for SMS and texting, but has become a great instrument of communication in a variety of ways. And 30% of our population have access to television. And the television is particularly important because of its visual impact and its capacity to be able to connect the audience emotionally to the subject that they're talking about. And then 22% have access to internet. And increasingly, the internet is having a critical role in the sense that the blogging world is alive with various types of messages and communications. So that when you begin to look at the media broadly, that is important to take into account the full range of the industry that we are dealing with. But also our media is profit-driven. The big question that you have to respond to usually is what the stock market says too often, because the profit motive is critical. And how does the profit motive tie into the question of the coverage and the content that we're going to see in a little while? There's increasing local conglomeration. I mean, a lot of media owners, a lot of media is increasingly coming under one influence. And when the media comes under one influence, the question we have to deal with is, how does that impact on the many voices that ought to be heard in the marketplace? Because the diversity of the media is helpful in increasing the space, the democratic space. But when they keep on merging under single ownership, what's the impact of that? When one person controls a big chunk of the media, is it helpful to the democracy, and particularly when we talk about the peace question? And this is going to be critical, in my view, when we begin to look at the notion of media as agenda setters. And then particularly vernacular press, increasingly the big chunk of given the fact that we have about 30% of our population in the urban and about 70% of the population in the rural, that the vernacular press that appeals to a lot of the rural community, but not just confined to the rural community, even the people in the urban, but who come from specific language groups, tend to follow these specific vernacular stations. And the studies that I've followed tend to suggest that, unlike what we see for the mainstream media, and what we mean by mainstream media here, we're talking about the national outreach media, the nations, the KTN groups, and others, is that there's a certain sense of lack of professionalism in the way that they tend to carry out their content, largely because most of this started as small media houses. There's been a tendency to get on board probably the loudest guy around town to either play the DJ music or to be able to sweet talk people in the morning and entice them to listen to the station. So when you compare the fact that these vernacular stations tend to be less professional, yet there's a greater association, attachment between the people and the station, then this plays very interestingly when we begin to look at elections and the role of media in that. But the other thing that we want to consider is looking back to 2008, and some of you will probably remember some of these headlines, and look at the, Irungu talked about the language and the language being important, and I just want to draw attention to the language that was being used in the media then. Look at the standard of that, and tight race as giants fight for survival. And attention here, particularly the word fight. And when we begin to frame stories in terms that are antagonistic, what is the impact of that on the overall material that we're going to carry? And if you look at that, again, sorry, the fact of picking on the standard is just that I didn't do a good sampling, so it's nothing to do with the standard. Please bear that in mind. I'm not saying the standard did this alone, but it's something that we found across the media. Final plea, final assault. So it's a fight, it's an assault. Intellect versus tact. Who will triumph? And so the constant framing of the stories in such militant, such antagonistic terms. And what does this have to, what's the relationship between this and the elections that we're going to have? And probably could these militant terms that have been used, the pairing of one side of the debate against the other side of the debate, could it have had a bearing on some of the images that we saw after the elections? And you all recall some of these things. And the question that has been debated is, what was the role of the media in this? And we look at the reports, the studies that were conducted as a result of the when doing the post-mortem in terms of how did the media conduct itself. Broadly speaking, the mainstream media were, most of the studies that we have looked at tend to suggest that the mainstream media carried themselves fairly well. And when they talk about the National Human Rights Commission, the Kriegler report, the Jajwaki report, they suggested that, broadly speaking, the mainstream media executed themselves relatively well. Now, when you talk about that, we don't necessarily mean that there was equal coverage. But studies in political, in campaigns tell us that the incumbent in elections tends to get greater coverage than the opposition. And so, that was the same case with Kenya, but it fits broadly within the larger scheme of things. So we do not necessarily look at that and say, because this happened this way, therefore this was, the mainstream media were biased in one case, because the incumbent tends to get a lot much more coverage. Biases in terms of coverage, I've just been paying attention to the photographs and the pictures on the front pages of the newspapers, and you will see who gets more space on the front page. And particularly if that is consistent for several days, and if you check for the last 1 week, including today, which side of the debate is having more space for photographs alone, and it begins to be a little bit indicative of the kind of biases that are seeping slowly into our media coverage of the elections. And so, because of the challenge that we have all the time, let me just focus on a few things that were pointed out, that in terms of vernacular stations, some of the studies seem to finger basically 4 stations, that they had highly loaded music, the use of proverbs, and the 4 stations that tended to be fingered included like Victoria, Kameme, Inoro, and Kas FM. I've been spending a little time on this, and the analysis may not necessarily be very systematic, because some of the tapes had been deleted, and arguing that the media houses have argued that because of the economic dictates, they had to reuse these tapes. As a result of that, some of the content is not available. So what we are basing some of this analysis on the content that is available. And the fact that they were translated into English, there might be some mismatches here and there in terms of how the translation went. So much of this material that I'm going to expose you to is has a lot to do with the convenience and availability of the data when we're looking for it. So maybe, broadly speaking, you probably would have had a different image emerging. But look at some of the content in 2007 November. Someone like Raila can't rear cattle because he has never done so. Now, cattle keepers and coffee growers and these people have never kept animals. How can he take care of cattle and he cannot work? These people cannot even do business. The ones in brackets are my own input for purposes of interpretation. And I could be wrong, so take that with a pinch of salt.
can't even do business. So he cannot govern the country with cattle keepers and poultry farmers. He does not even know how to fish, yet they are the fishermen. They fish and sell them to us, even though the fish do not belong to them. They rely on things given free by God. So this is part of the broadcast, and this broadcast ran at 8 a.m. in the morning in a vernacular station. The stupidity I see with mass action is huge, because when the police administer the tear gas canister, our leaders are whisked away in their vehicles while the stupid fellows. And from a journalism point of view, the choice of words, and thank you, Banairungu, for using that, for opening with that statement, the choice of words, if we have framed certain segments of society as stupid, it's really not the responsibility, the task of a journalist to categorize a group as stupid. And so that is an interesting choice of words. All Kenyans, especially the people from Mount Kenya, come out in large numbers and vote for the re-election of President Kibaki. If we don't re-elect him, we, the Kikuyu community, are finished. And so in terms of just looking at the language that was used in the lead up to that place, people of the House do not take this country backward by electing the ODM, and the terms that are being employed there do not allow so that this hatred could continue. So the constant terms that were employed in the lead up to the elections, particular interest in this was the boundaries that were not provided for. For example, Maina Kiai's family being invaded in a very strong sense by some of the broadcast. And I think the family should always, for any media house, particularly those who don't play public role, should always be out of bounds. In terms of cars, you again see some of the quotes that we have been able to pick up. The station reported rallying its audience to vote for the party that will take us there. You know which one. And the kind of language that was that's reported. Leaders who abuse office ought to be shown the door. They should not be elected at all, or they should be beaten and their property be banned. And so the position that the journalist takes in terms of what they are saying to the public, vote for the party that will take us there. I think, sorry, I already said that. The things that we should guard and be interested in is anything to do with land. And particular interest, of course, of picking on that is, the question of land is a motive. And you can see even in these elections how the debates and the discussions around land, whether we should talk about it or not talk about it, is a question that currently is being analyzed. Let nobody abuse our hospitality. And now, if we have somebody who speaks the language, maybe the interpretation there, if the translation is spot on, would be helpful. We should take time to think of our people who were evicted from from Mau and from Kipkurere in Mount Elgon. And so the history, going back into history to pick up from there. Our people, we are going to cross this river even if the bridge is shaking. Now remember, one mentioned earlier on that in fingering these stations, emphasis is being placed on the songs that they were playing, on the proverbs that they were using that resonate very easily with the population, unlike sometimes the overall statement that may be made. Let's carve Tamoikiet. Now, this is a circumcision song, and so on the surface of it, there's really no harm in singing the circumcision song. But in the context that it is played, you will realize that as a rite of passage, it tends to bind the individuals in a specific way, and the interpretation at the time that it is played has a bearing on how people are likely to move forward with it. It's the question of lack of training, lack of professionalism, the influence of both media owners and media managers, and then appeal to the traditional reading best. Here, really the issue of economics. Is the framing of the stories, the way they are framed, really possibly influenced a great deal by being able to sell in specific markets. And personal experience visiting certain sections of the country at that time suggested that you went to some places and you couldn't get certain media in those places. You went on the 3rd of January 2008, we choose peace. And what happened when the media chose a different path? And look at some of the the reasons why the media chose a different path: difficulty in newspaper distribution, falling ad revenue, pressure from the international community. But in one of the interviews, some editors proposed that you cannot do business with the dead. And so because you can't do it with the dead, therefore the movement towards this other direction. And a different path, why? Because these are the editorial from several newspapers, The Standard particularly, The Nation among others. The opposition's urging of voters to reject the results which saw questionable rallies in both government and opposition strongholds can only exacerbate matters. It's doubtful whether the electorate can realistically be expected to do this peacefully. In Kenya, protests trend to be violent. Looters and arsonists have proved in the last few days. What's the impact of this change? Hardened positions will only fuel conflict. Now, the media is saying that the opposition should not harden, so that positions by the political parties should not be hardened. We have said that if the veracity of both claims is not addressed and the rising tension stemmed through dialogue, we shall continue to fight with the fury and determination of the Kilkenny cats. In the end, the Scottish mythology says nothing was left of the cats but just the tails. And so reminding the country that if you do not step back and do something, where are we going to head? The editorial on the 3rd of January 2008, we propose that President Kibaki and Mr. Raila Odinga talk to each other. That way, that they agree to take action, an active part in stopping the violence gripping our country. Oh, the spelling there is real crazy. But the whole call to the two parties to come together and to sue for peace. So what we're saying is this: does media have a role to play in the question of peace? And the big answer here depends on what you stand on this debate. Many of us subscribe to the notion of agenda setting for the media. As a student of the media, I sometimes want to step back and say we need to be cautious, because once you say the media should set the agenda, then we are forgetting who is controlling the media, because if it's not a context of social responsibility, what makes us think that those guys with specific agenda will not set that specific agenda to be the national agenda? For example, the driving of tonight's debate, how do we know what the agenda behind it was, and even how the workings emerged? And if the question of responsibility comes in, then that stems the potential of a runaway managerial interest, runaway lack of professionalism, so that regulatory mechanism helps to push through what the media ought to do. What are we doing in the country at the moment? And several things are going on. First, there's recognition that there was a bit of non-professionalism, particularly in the vernacular media. And the Media Council of Kenya has been involved in a lot of training of vernacular journalists across the country. Now, does that mean we're out of the woods? Not exactly. We know some of the broadcasts that are taking place in certain parts of the country, particularly the coast and the other places, that sometimes worry. But one would hope that this training will possibly have an impact in stemming the slide to 2007. There's increased stepped up of media monitoring. And anybody who doesn't believe this ought to just visit the concerned spots. I mean, CCK is, I believe, is monitoring what's going on. The Media Council is certainly monitoring what is being broadcast every day. The ministries and all these spaces are concerned about the broadcasts that are taking place, and are able to try to raise alarm before the worst happens, hopefully before the worst happens. And so people who are broadcasting, people who have got the microphone, one should realize that they're holding a very critical task. They're tasked with a very critical responsibility. And what they say is very important. And then thirdly, there's a robust complaints commission currently going on, and we call upon people to raise and report instances where broadcasting houses, media houses are covering stories in a way that raises temperatures in the country. And this whenever one is reported, they will soon be called to account and be asked to explain why they're doing the things that they're doing. And then we have the election guide manual. And I'm glad that there are lots of journalists here. Probably a quick question: how many of us are familiar with the manual? And it's important not just to be familiar with the manual, but also to be familiar with the Code of Conduct for the Practice of Journalism, the second schedule in the Media Act. Because if we're able to follow those schedules, I mean those that Code of Conduct, if we're able to follow the election coverage manual, then we are able to act differently. And then lastly, the lessons from the past. When you look at what happened in 2007 and the challenges that we faced going through, then I would want to hope that we have learned our part and we would be able to step back from the brink. We'll be able to step back and not expose ourselves to challenges that would lead us to where we came from. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I think I've taken too much time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Levi. I think I allowed you to go on because I think the context is really critical within which the conversation can take place. So we've heard a little bit, I think, in terms of what the past has been. We've heard a little bit about what actions have been taken by the media community to frame stories differently, but also to create new codes of conduct and regulation. With a light touch, I think I would challenge the Nation Media Group comment about you cannot do business with the dead. You can do business with the dead. It's called transitions and obituaries in the back of the newspapers. But the question is whether you can run a whole newspaper that starts on page 1 with obituaries and finish on the last page. So I guess there we would agree. The challenge is really not so much to sell newspapers, but it's to give life, you know, where there are so many forces that want to take life. And that, I think, is the challenge on the journalists and the editors that are here present.